Howdy, howdy, howdy. Glad you joined me for Nuggets of Gold today. I don't know if you are like me as a Christian, as a guy who's trying to live my life for the glory of God. I have kind of a continual sense of wishing I was further along in my spiritual journey than I feel like I am on a day-to-day basis. Don't know if that ever happens to you. Like, I've been around the Bible for this long, I should know it better. Jesus has been good to me for so long, I should be obeying better. And this morning I was reading in Philippians chapter 1, came across a fairly familiar verse, and was reminded in a fresh way about the good side of feeling that tension of, I'm not where I want to be yet. I want to encourage you with this as our nugget today. Philippians 1:6. You may have heard it before. It's a fairly familiar verse, but let's give it a fresh listen and see how we can be encouraged by it in a positive way. Philippians 1:6 says this, I am sure of this. I am sure of this. I am confident of this, that God, who began a good work in you, will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. So Paul here is writing to this young church and he's saying, here's something I know for sure, that the God who started something in you is going to bring it to completion. And I think that's where I usually leave off the encouragement of the verse. That's good news. God started it. God's going to complete it. But then there's this last little phrase at the end. He who began a good work is going to complete it in the day of Christ Jesus. And for us, that means either God's going to complete the work when we die and meet Jesus face to face, or he's going to complete it when Jesus returns. But it is not right now. And so this verse creates the tension. God has begun a good work in you. God has raised you from the dead spiritually. God has given you his grace to bring you alive, to give you new desires for what is righteous, and to give you a new attitude about sin. It used to be reversed. It used to be you loved your sin most and you were willing to throw God in the back seat. And now as a Christian, God has begun a good work in you where you see sin and want to leave it behind and you want to put Jesus in the front seat. Or, as the song says, let Jesus take your wheel, right? And so it creates this tension of, man, I am alive and I wish I was further down the road. Man, I wish I was closer to my heavenly self, closer to my heavenly desires, closer to being able to live like Jesus than I find myself currently able to live today. Isn't that a good thing? Isn't it good that you have longings inside that are pulling you towards holiness? Now, I want to remind you of that if you feel frustrated that you're not further along, that feeling of frustration is God's grace pulling you forward. Don't fight it. Don't resist it. Let God draw you into growth. Now, what he says after this caught my eye as well. In verse 7 here, Philippians 1:7, he says, I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace. He reminds them that they have God's grace that has gripped them. First, God's grace saves us, and then God's grace begins to change us and bring us on this journey towards heaven. And just really quickly, I'm going to let you look up these next few verses because this was so powerful to me. But in the next few verses, 8, 9, 10, 11, Paul lists the kind of life areas that God's grace works on in us. He says, you were partakers of grace in my imprisonment, which means God's grace will help us in our difficulties, in our sufferings, in our hardships. He says, you were with me in my confirmation of the gospel, which means God's grace helps us when we try to do spiritual ministry with others, when we try to share Jesus, when we try to teach Jesus, when we try to do anything speaking of him, God's grace helps us. Then it goes on, Paul talks about his feelings for these people. So the grace of God can help us with our feelings, good, bad, or ugly. God's grace is with us. Then he talks about his love for people. God's grace helps us with our relationships. Then he talks about decision making. He talks about discerning and approving of what I should do and what is right. God's grace helps us make our choices. And then verse 11 talks about the fruit of righteousness. God's grace helps us to become who we're supposed to be, the right kind of people that glorify him. And so again, go back, look at those verses yourself. But I just want you to remember today that he who began a good work in you is going to complete it. And all along the journey, every part of it, your suffering, your decisions, your feelings, your relationships, he promises his grace is with you on the journey. That was good news for me this morning. God's grace to help me while I'm feeling like I want and I need to keep on growing. Take that good news, lean into that grace today. See you next time.